What's up, guys? This is Jay with FantasyLabs, back for our second live MLB breakdown show, where we show you guys how to use our tools leading up to lock in real time to help with your lineups. And once again, I'm joined here by Pete, aka CSU Ram 88, who last time was furiously sweating his golf lineups. Pete, how's it going, man?
Doing well, man. Yeah, I was really sweating PGA, our last show. PGA Championship was a lot of fun. Had a good sweat down at the end. Stenson kind of screwed me, but it was really fun and good to see Jimmy Walker win with, actually some drama because Jason Day made eagle on 18. So that was a lot of fun. Golf's still in full swing. We're actually going to be recording our podcast for the Travelers coming up tonight. So golf's fun, but obviously we're in the heart of baseball season, and Tuesday night is one of the best nights of the week. So I'm for it.
Yeah, definitely. And how was your golf sweat, by the way?
Dude, it was intense. I got to watch it with the old man. My dad and I watched a lot of the tournaments together, especially the majors. So it was definitely a fun sweat. What about you, Jay? Any fun sweats recently?
I haven't had a really fun sweat in a while. But yeah, we did talk about this off air about the best sweats we've ever had. Pete, you got any in mind that you're obsessed with? The best sweat you've ever felt?
I think the most entertaining sweat was the basketball championship in 2015. I was really rooting for Andrew Wiggins to win, and Gallinari went for like 65 fantasy points, and I brought him in. And then Jay Crowder just needed like a rebound or an assist or anything to pass him for first, and got it within like the last minute. So that was definitely an intense sweat, rooting for a friend.
Yeah, for sure. The only sweat I can think of was also NBA. And during like a really busy night, I decided to run to Chick-fil-A, pick up food, and head back before lineup block. And I made it like just in time. I don't know, man. DFS is just all about the sweat, and it's just a good feeling that you can't really get in other aspects. So it's pretty awesome.
Racing for Chick-fil-A though, man. That's a high priority. Got to get it done.
Yeah, you got to do it. Anyways, though, let's get into this show. We definitely had an interesting last few days with a lot of trade rumors leading up to this. We had the non-waiver trade deadline yesterday. We had Max Kepler establishing his GOATness, Danny Duffy as well, forcing 35 swings and misses against the Rays. And we can break down the trade deadline a little bit later, but some things that stand out to me with what happened is, the Rangers lineup obviously improved a lot with Lucroy and Beltran. We should have multiple value plays each night with that lineup. The Mets acquiring Jay Bruce to complete an outfield where they have no center fielder at all. Although tonight they did bench Granderson and have De Aza in center there. But the Yankees bullpen is another one that should be affected the rest of the season without Chapman and now Andrew Miller. So, Pete, how much value do you think there is in kind of applying DFS principles to some of these trade deadline moves?
There's definitely some value in it, and I think the most applicable thing that's going to happen here down the road is we'll start seeing guys get called up down the stretch with bigger rosters. So there'll be a lot of opportunities to play rookies, and that creates a lot of value because a lot of times they'll be min-priced, and you just kind of have to decipher guys that we don't have, as much data on, and certainly makes things interesting at the end of the year.
Yeah, I think most of it with the trade deadline is just kind of finding value where other people aren't looking. Most people are looking at the Indians improving with Andrew Miller. And not really looking at deploying stacks against the Yankees when they have a diminished bullpen. So I think there's value to be had there. And let's switch gears a little bit. We'll head over to our tools here on FantasyLabs.com. Let's see. All right, so we're on the models page, and tonight's a full 15 game slate. And I think today's show, we're going to discuss kind of how to differentiate between elite pitchers and combine them with stacks for tournaments. And one tournament that stands out for tonight in particular that we'll focus on is the Super Fastball on DraftKings, which is a $33 buy-in, $400K prize pool, $100K to first place, 14,000 entries. So definitely a tourney we recommend playing. Pete, how many you going pretty hard in this one tonight?
I'm going to fire some in there. Definitely playing cash games tonight as well, so I won't have a crazy tournament exposure, but it's an interesting night. Definitely a great tournament with a huge top prize, which is great, and a lot of different options on DraftKings from both the hitting perspective and a pitching perspective tonight.
Yeah, I think one thing that stands out to me looking at the models page right away is that we have a high volume of expensive pitchers on DraftKings. We have 6 pitchers actually all over 10K. So Pete, I think in general, we both agree that putting an emphasis on pitching is key, not only in cash games but also tournaments. So we can go ahead actually and go into our trends tool to create a trend to kind of help illustrate the significance of elite pitchers. So we can go ahead and create a trend that reflects pitchers on DraftKings who fit certain criteria by adding filters. And I always choke with a name for these, but we'll just go ahead and go with that and set this up. And then we can find the salary filter here on the left. All right, we could set this to a minimum of 10K to get these pitchers at the elite paid for position. And then one thing, I think that's good is we both put a lot of weight into the K predictor. So for this trend, you can go down to trends and click K prediction. And we can use this to pick pitchers who have a minimum of, let's say, 8 strikeouts for that night. We can already automatically see the plus minus here of plus 4.44 for pitchers who match this trend. So we can see a couple that stand out on this slate. And I think this is just one way you can kind of highlight top pitchers that you think are in the best chance. And I think you can kind of avoid Yu Darvish a little bit as his pitch count has still been below 95, even though they say he's going to keep increasing a bit more. But I think the main thing is that Madison Bumgarner just stands out so much. And Pete, is he kind of the top pitcher for you on the slate?
He definitely is a top pitcher. I think the guy who still has the most upside is Jose Fernandez, but pitching against the Cubs in Chicago makes it a tough decision. I think for cash games, I definitely lean Bumgarner. For tournaments, though, certainly understand going Jose Fernandez or even a guy like Carlos Carrasco or on DraftKings, obviously you need 2. Don't mind pairing both these guys together and going with a lot of value bats because there's so much K upside with the top guys.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, looking at the Vegas totals, we can kind of pick some of these teams that have really low implied run totals and kind of target those pitchers attacking those teams. What other kind of pitchers are you looking at on the slate?
Well, let's talk a little bit more because I think it is a big debate tonight, especially in tournaments. For the fastball in particular, Jose Fernandez just versus Bumgarner. Obviously, you have Bum here against the Phillies, who it's a great matchup. They have a lower team total, and he's a much bigger favorite. So on FanDuel, that matters even more, where the win matters more. But on DraftKings, where it's just about efficiency and strikeouts are so critical, I mean, Jose Fernandez, if you look on our models tool here, his K per 9 is basically 13. And he's just been incredible. He's still, in my opinion, the best strikeout pitcher in baseball. Yu Darvish is definitely up there once he gets 100%, but he's the guy who I think has the highest upside in Ks. So what are your thoughts? I mean, how would you rate Bumgarner versus Jose, specifically for a tournament?
Yeah, I think that's the whole point here is the tournament. I mean, you look at Bumgarner, and it's not a coincidence he's the top pitcher on the Bales model. He's facing the Phillies. They're currently implied at 2.9 runs. We all know the Phillies are atrocious against left-handed pitching, ranking dead last in team WOBA against lefties this year. So if I'm firing a single bullet in this tournament, I'm definitely looking to differentiate from the majority. So that's when you look at a guy like Jose Fernandez, who does lead all pitchers in strikeout per 9, 12.98 right here. So that's a guy, I'm looking at, and they sat Chris Bryant today. I think they're just kind of getting more left-handed bats in that lineup. But I think Jose is a guy you look at in this tournament, just 300 less than Bumgarner, and you're going to see pretty wide disparity of ownership between the two. One other pitcher I kind of like on this slate is Matt Shoemaker. And you can create another trend, actually, to kind of illustrate Shoemaker this season, just kind of looking at him at home and just how great he's been. So let's set this trend up real quick. And we can go to player filters when this loads. Well, this is loading, Pete. Do you have any other pitchers you're kind of looking at in this tournament? I know it's a 14,000 person tournament. So you kind of have to get contrarian in a few ways. And I think it kind of starts with pitching, but it's hard to just pick guys that don't have upside. So how do you kind of go about getting guys at low ownership, but also maintaining that elite upside?
Well, there's a ton of upside plays. One leverage play if you want to go crazy. And just the way I'm kind of looking at this too is just the K per 9 and how many strikeouts we're expecting for some of these guys tonight with the K predictor. But going down the list, I mean, obviously DeGrom has a lot of upside. I don't specifically like him, but I think he's fine. David Price, another guy I think people will choose tonight. I mentioned Carrasco earlier, who I actually like a lot. But then there's some really big wild cards. Obviously, Darvish, you hit on. I think he has a lot of upside. But if you wanted the ultimate leverage play, go McCarthy tonight. Still getting a lot of strikeouts. It's in Coors Field. Super risky play. But he's priced so cheaply. You can stack the Dodgers with him if you want to go that route. That I think he's an intriguing option just because he has a lot of K upside. I would never in a million years consider him in cash, and he's probably going to have a below average outcome a lot. But in the event that he does have that really good outing, he has the K upside, and you can get really expensive bats with him because he's so cheap tonight.
Yeah, I agree. And he has been pitching really well. I don't know if I'll actually go that route, target Coors Field pitching. I am on the side of kind of fading Coors Field overall in terms of hitters. But so we got this trend with Shoemaker here, and you can kind of see in 9 games at home, he's averaged 21.76 DraftKings points. And he's facing a team without Josh Reddick, who is a lefty bat with an 816 OPS this season. You have Shoemaker just 8,500. So he's a guy I'm kind of targeting that I think at low ownership will help you afford some of these expensive stacks. And speaking of stacks, Pete, I just wanted to ask what your thoughts are kind of on DraftKings, especially since we're talking about this specific tournament, on utilizing 4 and 5 man stacks for this 14,000 person tournament.
Oh, I think it's the way to go. I mean, I think you doing a 15 man or a 5 man stack in the majority of your lineups is absolutely the way to go. Correlation is so important in baseball. We've seen it over and over again. And obviously more people are doing it now than ever before, and it dilutes, the upside of the strategy to a degree. But it's still, in my opinion, the best overall strategy for tournaments. So I think it makes a lot of sense, and you can differentiate yourself in a lot of different ways and still have a lot of leverage. And, I was talking about McCarthy before. That's only for the very bold. That is like a suicide choice for a cash game, something I would never do. But for tournaments, sometimes you have to take big risks, and I think he's one of them. I think that for tonight in the tournament, in terms of hitting, I would do as much correlation as possible, mix it up with 5 man stacks, maybe 5 with a 3 man stack on the other side. So it's not the same game, obviously, but I think that's the way to go. What do you think, Jay?
Yeah, I mean, I think you definitely want to get contrarian in this type of tournament. I think one thing, I like looking at is sorting pitchers by home run per 9. We kind of have 3 guys who stand out the top in LeBlanc, Folty, and Anibal Sanchez. We do have James Shields hovering towards the top, who earlier this season, of course, was very, very bad, but he's actually been pitching really well lately. 1.71 ERA, 209 opponents average in his last 6 starts, which has been a top 5 ERA in the AL. So I'm looking at exposure to these teams facing these pitchers that are prone to home run balls, specifically, the Red Sox. I think a lot of people will be off them, especially on a Coors Field slate. They have a pretty negative park factor percentile as well. I think you can look at Pittsburgh, even though McCutchen is out, and then going with the White Sox as well. So you can head to our lineups page, actually, and kind of view the implied totals for these teams that we're kind of thinking about stacking. And scrolling down to the Red Sox, you can see that they're just at 4.2 runs. We got the Pirates as well are just at 4.2, and the White Sox at 4.2 as well. So on a Coors Field slate where we have, a couple teams that are implied at over 5 runs, we got some other teams up there pretty close. I think it's important to kind of go these teams that are in the middle because it's such a kind of wide margin and the variance is so high in baseball that these are teams on a night by night basis that I like targeting, teams that you can kind of almost guarantee will have low ownerships. They're good indicators looking at the current implied total, finding out how much exposure they're going to have in tournaments from other people. So it's a way for me to get off the general public, and not just this $33 tournament, but kind of all tournaments together. So Pete, what are some other kind of data points that you look at when going through and selecting stacks for your multiple tournament entries?
So one angle you can take is playing teams on the road, because you know that they're going to get, or they're guaranteed the ninth inning at bats, which definitely matters in these stacks. So I always am trying to look at teams that are, on the road. Another thing that we kind of glossed over is taking teams that have a positive park shift versus a negative park shift. That's why I do think Boston will be low owned, because they're still expensive. It's tough to take teams that, move away from a really good hitter's park, especially when they're transitioning into a much more pitcher-friendly park, because their prices are normally still elevated. But I do think you can take advantage of the other way. St. Louis, for example, I think is a great option tonight. Going to Cincinnati, good hitter's park, especially for lefties. And I think the matchup here is pretty good. Straley's not great, but the one thing is he's not awful in terms of how many home runs he gives up. So it'd be a little bit more ideal if you had one of the other red starters. But I still think the Cardinals make for a great stack tonight. I do think they'll be somewhat obvious to some people. You'll see on the lineups page here as well. They have a ton of trends, but that's a stack that I like quite a bit. And, Coors Field, I agree with you. Actually, I'm probably going to fade that. Normally, I'm all in on Coors Field, and I might have a little exposure, but I do think it's a good fade of any. Gray, in my opinion, is the best pitcher for the Rockies, so that makes sense.
Yeah, and I pulled up the stacks, which is the tool I like to utilize a lot, especially when entering tournaments and entering multiple lineups and kind of getting different exposure percentages within that stack. You see we have a 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 7 ways to differentiate. But the bigger point here is that the Dodgers make up the top 5 stacks of the night. And I think this is also another good indicator. You think, okay, they're at Coors Field, all the stacks, the Dodger stacks the best. We got Reddick hitting cleanup in his first game there. I think it's pretty safe to say that the Dodgers will carry probably the highest ownership in this tournament. And yeah, like you said, our boy John Gray is on the mound. So do you think, it's a viable strategy in this tournament to just completely fade the Dodgers, whether you're firing a single bullet or you kind of have put in 20 or 30?
I definitely think it's a viable strategy. You have to take a stance. In those late games too, another team I didn't bring up earlier that fits the criteria is the Nationals. So I really like going into Arizona, good hitters park, and they actually have some lefty killers in the lineup. So and going back to Coors Field, the most equity probably for the best stack tonight is the Dodgers, but there's a lot of value in fading them to be contrarian, and that's what we know about baseball, and that's the tournament element of it. So I think it definitely makes sense, and I actually don't mind it at all, specifically tonight, because I think John Gray is the most talented pitcher on the Rockies by far, and he has the potential to shut someone down. So we'll see what happens, but I don't mind the fade there.
Yeah, absolutely. And going back to our models, we can highlight Gray here and look at his consistency in the last month, which has been 80%, 0% dud rate in his last 5 starts. So, he hasn't given up over 4 runs in his last 12 starts. He's given up just 2 runs in his last 3 starts combined, 2 on the road, but he's still been pitching well at home. So for these reasons, as well as kind of the anticipated high ownership of the Dodgers, I'm most likely just completely off them in tournaments. I'm trying to get first place out of 14,000, and I don't want to be competing with all these other Dodgers stacks. And
Jay, one thing that I'm just looking at is this game log. I remember this goes back to our roots playing season-long fantasy. We had quality starts actually as a stack. That was one of our categories. And he should have, 6 in a row. He's 5 in a row, but almost 6 in a row, where he's gone over 6 innings and given up 3 earned runs over the last. The one before that against the Blue Jays, he pitched 7 innings, had 8 Ks, but gave up 4 runs. So in my mind, just looking at it, it's been 6 really great starts in a row, a lot of K upside. Obviously, I still think the Dodgers are going to put a lot of runs on the board, but if you're going to fade Coors Field, it's nice when John Gray's on the mound.
Yeah, it's a tough situation. Obviously, in cash, I still want some Dodgers exposure. You look at his game log and you see, his last 2 home starts were against the Braves and the Phillies, 2 teams aren't really known for their hitting as much. This is a much different offense who has historically fared well in Coors Field. I feel like Adrian Gonzalez hits a home run every single time he comes to Denver. But, you have a lot of guys there. But I think in this tournament, it kind of makes sense. And then after the Dodgers stacks, you brought up Washington. They are actually the next highest rated stack according to rating on our Pro Trends. And that's a team, you look at last night, their lineup hasn't been confirmed yet, but that's a team I think, you definitely want exposure to it. And taking a question really quick, we got Pat Nasty 24. That's a sweet name. Asks, is Washington going to go into regression after a big night last night, or is the momentum going to carry? So Pete, I think we can look at this game and break it down, but I think for this tournament especially, we want to kind of think in terms of how many people are going to deploy national stacks after watching them last night. Turner at the leadoffs, 8 for 8 in steals, are being perfect. Do you think their ownership will creep up after a big game? Is that usually kind of what happens?
Right. And in general, you don't want to be buying the recency bias, especially when game theory is involved in tournaments. But I still think it's a great spot, and I don't mind doing it. But yeah, putting up 14 runs on 19 hits certainly will make people aware of what happened. So I do still think it's a good choice. But yes, the ownership will be higher with the Nationals.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that. And one way I think it's a great way to build stacks for some of these lower owned teams is kind of scroll down the list of these top stacks and just kind of pinpoint. I mean, the Tigers are a great one as well. The Indians, like we stated, there's a few that kind of might be in spots where they'll have low ownership. And I think those are kind of the teams in this tournament and other large field tournaments that you kind of want to build around. So let's move on to kind of individual hitters, just looking at the model here. One thing I like to do is target platoon hitters that are in good spots. And I think one guy that stands out, if we go to our ISO differential here for hitters tonight, is Brandon Moss, who they put in the 2-hole. He just got off the DL. It's his first game back. I think looking at him, obviously we like the 614 slugging percentage against right-handed.
ISO diff, bro. It's ISO diff. Massive.
Yeah. Massive ISO diff, 263. So he stands out to me a lot, a 411 WOBA against righties. And you look at his salary, and I actually kind of like this in terms of this specific tournament. The Cardinals are applied at a healthy 4.7 run. So I don't think they'll be completely under the radar. But you look at Brandon Moss's bargain rating, which is 4%. Which is horrible. I think he's pretty overpriced for his first game back at 4,600. But that kind of makes me like him even more in this tournament. If you're going to want cash exposure to Moss, you'll probably want to do so on FanDuel, where you can afford him a bit easier. He doesn't take as much of your salary cap up. But at 4,600, I think it might scare some people off. It's his first game back. A lot of unknowns. So I think he'll carry a pretty low ownership percentage in this tournament compared to what he would be if he was fairly priced. So he's a guy I'm kind of looking at in that game to target, to kind of tack on to my stacks. What are some other hitters you're kind of looking at on this slate?
Well, if you're going to stay in the same game, I think one of the best values on the board, the other lefty, is Matt Adams, Fat Matt. I think his price is just way too cheap on DraftKings. He's 3,400. He's batting cleanup on a team that we like. Has positive ISO differential, good park for him. I think he's a fantastic hitter. If you want to go expensive at first base, you want to go the opposite. You think, okay, a lot of people are going to be on Matt Adams. I'm going to go with a different roster construction to be a little different. I love spending all the way up to Miguel Cabrera, who's one of the highest rated players in my model right now. I believe he's rated highly in Bale's model as well. He's a guy who's really expensive, 5,400. Obviously worth it. Miguel Cabrera is one of the best hitters in baseball still, and he's in a good matchup. So I don't mind going that way as well, because I do think Matt Adams, out of all the Cardinals, is going to be the most heavily owned player. 3,400 is just way too cheap for him.
Yeah, I completely agree, and that kind of goes into how much we like the Cardinals overall in this slate. And yeah, you brought up Miguel Cabrera. So for this tournament, I think with his recent performance, he's a guy, it's obviously been on fire. He has good surface numbers, 403 WOBA against righties. Like I mentioned earlier, he is facing James Shields, who has been pitching pretty well. But more importantly, I think his ownership will kind of creep up there, and he'll be a somewhat chalky play. So I think if you do decide to go some Dodgers or Rockies exposure, I think Miguel Cabrera makes sense as a guy you might fade to get a bit contrarian with your other plays. And yeah, one thing, you can look at to kind of just get an idea roughly of what hitters might offer the most values. You can sort by Pro Trends for DraftKings. and you can see some of these Cardinals players pop up, like Matt Adams, who you mentioned, Mike Napoli, who has been hitting the ball very, very hard recently, and paid off last night. I believe he hit a home run, or the other night. So I think there are a lot of different ways you can kind of get exposure to these elite bats, individual bats that you kind of fill in between your stacks. Since we're both on the side of you definitely want to stack in these types of tournaments, put in multiple stacks if you're throwing multiple entries. So let's go ahead actually, and Pete, what do you think your favorite stack is tonight? Just kind of all things considered, ownership, upside, and everything.
I mean, I'm kind of a chalk guy in general, so I'll go a little away from Coors Field, which 95% of the time would be the choice I'd make regardless. I am biased, and I do think over time, stacking Coors Field's done really well for me. But I think my two favorite are definitely the Cardinals, and I'm going to put the Nationals up there too. I do see that they're going to be a little bit more heavily owned, but I still think it's a great spot. Curious to see the lineup, though. I want to make sure Trey Turner's batting leadoff. I want to see Ramos, Worth, Rendon, Zimmerman all in there. So we'll see what happens. But I like those stacks quite a bit. They fit the criteria I talked about. Both teams moving to more hitter-friendly parks. They're on the road. They're going to get the ninth inning at bats. All have a bunch of pro trends. So I think they're two great options tonight.
Yeah, I completely agree with both of those. And I think one thing you can do is go ahead and go to the Cardinals, pull up their team for tonight. You can sort by pro trends. You can sort by whatever you want that you like, but I would get exposure to these guys. So, I think Matt Adams, if you lock in these guys, Adams, Moss, we talked about, and then you get exposure to Matt Holliday and the beast, Jed Jerko, I think you can lock these guys in. And, I think with this somewhat contrarian stack, you can kind of maybe lock in a not so contrarian pitcher as your kind of elite guy. So you could even go Bumgarner in this one and optimize here to kind of get an idea of something you can fill out. So you can see, this gives us some Dodgers exposure, of course. We got some Nationals exposure as well. So for this lineup, I think you're kind of banking on the Cardinals obviously coming through, but also not having too high of ownership where Bumgarner will likely be the chalkiest pitcher. Dylan Bundy, is pretty bold on this slate, so you could probably X him out if you don't want to save at pitcher too much facing that really tough lineup, or you could save in other spots, maybe take Bumgarner down a bit, and so on and so forth. So I think these are all ways, you can kind of mix exposure up pretty well in these tournaments, and just kind of remember you don't need to go fully contrarian. So I think vice versa from this lineup, if you have exposure to Coors Field, you probably want to go contrarian with your other hitters especially, and the pitchers as well. So what are some other things you think you're kind of looking at for this specific tournament, 14,000 person tournament? Do you have advice for people kind of looking at putting in either one entry or maybe 10? Do you have advice to kind of, do you play those differently depending on how many teams you're putting in?
I think the whole goal here is taking a stance, taking an angle, and going with it. You can't cover all the bases, no pun intended. With DFS baseball, it just doesn't work that way. So you have to take a strong stance, and that's the best way to attack this tournament. I do have some questions here on Twitter, Jay, that I saw. Is Mad Bum worth the price for cash? Lots of good starting pitchers tonight. Right now, compared with price, I do think Mad Bum is definitely worth it for cash. I assume you're on the same page, Jay.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you look at all the things Bum's got going for him. The only negative thing I can really think of is he's not pitching at home in San Francisco, a massive pitcher's park. But for me in cash, we pretty much always pay up at pitching in cash games. I think Bumgarner's pretty safe. Again, reiterating the Phillies really struggle to hit left-handed pitchers. So, yeah, he's in a spot. I think Ruiz had good numbers against him for the BVP truthers out there, and he's not playing either. So they got Rupp in there. So I think Bumgarner makes a lot of sense in cash, and a guy that I'm pretty comfortable playing in cash. But like we said, in this type of tournament, I think you can afford to fade him or at least go under the public in your personal exposure.
Definitely. Someone asked, what are your thoughts on a Cubs stack? I can never pick on Jose, but again, that's a leverage play. Some people are going to have Jose will still be pretty heavily owned in this tournament. I don't think many people will be on the Cubs at all. Definitely great hitters. If they get to Jose early, we saw him have one really bad outing, I believe, against Arizona this year. it could happen. So I that's not the direction I would go, but certainly if you're feeling bold, that's an interesting stack.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, pulling up his game, like you can see, he gave up 5 runs last start against the Cards. He's given up 6 to the Braves, but he's been pretty consistent in terms of shutting teams down. Obviously, a lot of strikeouts, not letting too many people on base. So I think it's tough, but we're not really breaking down the matchup. We're breaking down the ownership with a question like this, and I think it makes sense. It depends, if it's a long-term thing. If you're only throwing in a single entry every night, I think it might take a while. But when you're just targeting the most elite pitcher of the night every night as kind of your one entry, it might take a while for that to hit and to pay off. I do think it's a viable strategy on most nights, kind of targeting. I mean, even last night we saw a lot of people on Salazar in tournaments, thinking he had a good match against the Twins, and we kind of all saw what happened there. The Twins, had incredibly low ownership. Our boy Kepler, came through huge. Mauer, a lot of guys just crushed, and they were around the 1% ownership. I think on FanDuel, some of those guys were under 1%. So it's a similar circumstance. You never know when Jose will get pulled and the bullpen could implode. I think the Cubs are even more intriguing with Chris Bryant out of the lineup. I think people will be even more off them. So I can see it. I just think consistently it's a strategy that's tough depending on how many entries you put in.
Yep, I think that's very good advice.
And we actually did have a question from Brian, who did have a big night with a twin stack. He asked us over under 5 Kepler dongs tonight. What do you got, Pete?
I'll take the over with 7 dongs. I mean, yeah. he's gonna go ham tonight, right, Jay?
I mean, yeah, I think, I think he could definitely hit 4, at least 4 more, maybe 5. So I think Kepler is a pretty good play. Do we have any other questions for this, Pete, on the Twitter?
Do you think Collins is a punt play tonight? I think I just saw that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's horrible. I think, there are other teams to target. I think he makes more sense to me in terms of kind of as a stack as a whole. I wouldn't kind of individually target him too much there. So what are you?
Yeah, I think he's a great play. 2.5K on DraftKings on the team with one of the highest team totals. I think it's a great play. Probably pretty popular as a punt play overall. So I do like the idea of putting him with the rest of the Tigers, but we'll see how they do in general in terms of ownership. I think they'll be pretty heavily owned.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think Miggy will be the guy that stands out a lot. I think Collins is he's hitting 6, so it's not a spot where I'm really targeting in cash games all too often. And then we did mention Shields has been pitching a whole lot better lately than he was when he first came to the White Sox. So it's a spot I think you can get away with it in cash games, but I'd probably still look elsewhere. I know he's really cheap, and that's kind of the main thing when considering him on a team that's applied to score a lot of runs.
Yeah, someone else asked about the Astros stack. They have a really high team total, and I definitely think they are good. And he mentioned a stat. I don't know if it's 100. I haven't checked it myself yet, but he said R.A. Dickey's given up 7 home runs in 33 innings in Minute Maid. Interesting stat for sure. And there's some data to back up throwing when the roof's closed with a knuckleball. So we'll see. I do think that there's a lot of upside with Astros every night. I mean, they have one of the most explosive lineups. So certainly think they're a viable option. I think they'll be kind of, again, one of those teams that could be somewhat heavily owned, or it could be the surprise that they're so low owned. Definitely think it's viable.
Yeah, I think most nights I always want to get some exposure to the Astros. I really like this lineup as well. We've seen Springer, his hard hit percentage lately, hitting atop the lineup, of course, has been crushing. You pay up for him. You pay up for most of these guys, actually. So I think Dickey's a pitcher that when he struggles, he really struggles, but he's been actually somewhat consistent this season, so it's tough. But yeah, I like some exposure. I think they'll be kind of under the radar, especially on a Coors Field slate. So I definitely don't mind turning exposure to the 1 through 5 hitters there.
Right, for sure.
All right, I think that's all the questions we got. Pete, you got any kind of last words for people who maybe want to enter this DraftKings $33 tournament tonight?
Get in there. Would love to see someone take home $100,000, and good luck in all your contests tonight. It's just another great fun night of MLB DFS on Tuesday. So hoping everyone does well.
Definitely. Good luck, you guys, and we'll be back with another live show for you guys breaking down Friday's slate. So good luck until then, guys.